In the cold void between stars, entire worlds burn while the galaxy turns, indifferent and unyielding. Armies clash, Xenos infestations erupt, and billions cry for salvation that will never come. And yet, unseen, unheard, operating in shadows that even the Emperor's light cannot pierce, a force moves with deliberate precision. They do not wield bolters or chains words. They do not command fleets or legions. They intervene quietly, invisibly, shaping survival, guiding fate, and threading order through the chaos of billions of lives. They are the Silent Sisterhood, the hidden hand that moves across the Imperium, altering outcomes in ways no record will ever acknowledge. Every life preserved, every mission completed, every victory claimed in the name of humanity bears their silent signature. And now, their story, their unseen, unrecorded, and morally bound influence, begins to unfold. Even in a galaxy consumed by war, the smallest choice can echo across worlds. And the sisters are always watching. If you want to witness the hidden power that shapes the fate of billions, dive into this story, subscribe, and join us as we uncover the Silent Sisterhood's invisible hand moving through the Imperium. The world below was a fractured mosaic of steel and soot, a hive city scarred by centuries of conflict, its spires clawing at skies thick with ash and the distant, indifferent glow of the Astronomicon. Smoke billowed from the wreckage of manufactorums long abandoned yet still belching the faint scent of burning promethium. Here, the rhythm of war was not measured in victories or losses but in the silent endurance of those who survived each day beneath the Imperium's indifferent gaze. Among the population, rumors whispered of the Silent Sisterhood, an order whose presence was rarely acknowledged, whose interventions were ghostly and almost mythic. Most dismissed such tales as pious fantasy, yet the evidence lingered in impossible rescues, the inexplicable survival of certain officials, and the subtle realignment of power in the wake of disasters that should have claimed lives indiscriminately. In the shadow of a fractured spire, an acolyte named Sister Valeria moved with the precision of one trained to blend into obscurity. Her robes, soot-stained and lined with discreet protective runes, clung to her form as she navigated the narrow alleys filled with scavengers and the occasional patrol of the local Arbites. Every step was a lesson in balance. Avoid detection, preserve energy, observe, and remain invisible. She carried no weapon larger than a ceremonial bolter pistol, yet she bore the weight of unspoken authority, a weight heavier than the armored land raiders that patrolled the hive above. The Sisterhood did not rely on firepower. Their strength lay in secrecy, in understanding the invisible threads that bound cause and consequence across the Imperium. Valeria's mind was a map of subtle signals, the flutter of a tattered banner signaling allegiance, the scent of scorched metal revealing a covert manufactorum raid, the sudden silence of children in a street signaling danger unseen. Tonight, all signals converged into a singular pattern, a shift in the current of fate she could not yet name. Somewhere beyond the haze, the distant rumble of a Lehman Russ engine echoed across the hive, followed by a mechanical clang that suggested a Skitarii patrol, scanning the lower levels for insurgents or worse. Valeria ducked into a shadowed alcove, her fingers brushing the data slate she carried beneath her robes. A message, encoded in the language of the Sisterhood, flickered to life, confirming what she already suspected. Unseen eyes had been watching, guiding, and perhaps protecting events she had only begun to understand. Her path took her to a square scarred by recent bombardments, where smoke choked the narrow streets and promethium pools reflected the flickering light of distant fires. A group of Astra Militarum conscripts huddled beneath a shattered archway, their vox grills cracked and distorted, transmitting fragmented orders from a command structure that had already lost cohesion. They were terrified, unprepared, expendable. In the quiet of her mind, Valeria knew the Sisterhood had chosen their moment carefully. The world might burn, the guards might fall, yet certain individuals would endure, guided by hands they could neither see nor comprehend. She breathed in the acrid tang of smoke, tasted the grit of ash on her tongue, and stepped forward, invisible yet indispensable. As she moved, the notion of power without recognition weighed upon her. The Imperium celebrated heroes who wielded bolters, led battalions, or glorified martyrdom and statuary in him. The Sisterhood existed between these definitions, operating in silence, their victories uncounted and unrecorded. Valeria felt the paradox keenly. To act was to alter history, yet to act openly was to surrender the very essence of the order. And so, she moved through the night like a shadow-rendered flesh, listening, observing, shaping outcomes invisible to all but the most attentive. Somewhere ahead, a small industrial complex shuddered under the indirect strike of an orc bombardment. Supplies critical to the planet's defense teetered on the edge of destruction, and yet, unseen by the enemy, subtle interventions had already begun. Hydraulic valves misaligned, targeting systems slightly off, servitors redirected by imperceptible hands. The Sisterhood worked through inference, probability, and devotion, bending reality without leaving evidence. Every step took her closer to the heart of the conflict, and yet she felt the eyes of her sisters in the shadows, a silent chorus guiding, cautioning, and approving her movements. It was not magic, not in the way psychers wield the warp, but a discipline cultivated over centuries of devotion, observation, and faith. Valeria did not need to witness miracles, she needed only to witness the world as it was, and through that knowledge, enact the Sisterhood's will. As she paused atop a shattered stairwell, observing the chaos below, she understood that tonight, like every night, survival was a matter of perception, timing, and invisible influence. Somewhere in the smoke, destiny awaited her touch. The air above the square vibrated faintly with distant cannon fire, a rhythm that spoke of battles unfolding far beyond the immediate ruin. Valeria crouched behind the remains of a servitor docking station, listening to the mechanical groans of the wounded machines. Their joints jerked spasmodically as if in protest to some unseen cruelty, their servos half dead but still moving. To the untrained eye, these servitors were nothing but inert machinery, yet the Sisterhood understood them as extensions of the world's pulse. A misaligned gear here, a neglected circuit there, and a desperate civilian or soldier might survive long enough to turn the tide of a minor skirmish, unseen, unpraised, but crucial. Her data slate flickered again, the encoded glyphs confirming another intervention underway, miles away, tied directly to the movement she now undertook. The square had become a living chessboard, with each conscript, each scavenger, each piece of rubble part of a broader, invisible pattern. Valeria moved carefully, avoiding the half-collapsed walls, her boots sinking into the ash-laden ground. The cries of children mixed with the metallic groan of failing machinery, creating a symphony of despair that had become the Sisterhood's natural cadence. She did not flinch. She had learned to absorb this world's pain as one breathes air, integrating it into strategy rather than letting it paralyze action. Ahead, a small supply cache lay exposed, its containers leaking promethium that hissed and smoked as if in warning. Guards, weary and half-blinded by exhaustion and dust, fumbled with their rifles, unaware of the subtle guidance from unseen hands that allowed Valeria a narrow path to approach. Timing was everything. A single misstep, a single misjudged movement, and the fragile balance of survival could collapse. Yet she was never alone. Her sister's presence was a quiet certainty, a whisper of authority that shaped instinct, intuition, and courage. As she moved past the first container, a shadow shifted in the corner of her vision. An orc warband had strayed into the lower levels, its braying and stomping shaking loose chunks of masonry. Most mortals would panic. Valeria's heart rate did not quicken. She had long since trained it to move in sync with the rhythm of hidden forces rather than the apparent chaos. Every instinct she had cultivated over years, every silent prayer, every careful observation, every hand of guidance unseen, came together. She adjusted a leaking valve with the tip of her gauntlet finger, redirecting a burst of promethium vapor just enough to create a smoke screen, obscuring the supply cache from the orc's crude sight. It was a small act, almost trivial in the scale of war, yet it was precise, deliberate, and life-saving. Beyond the smoke, she caught sight of the young conscripts huddled under the shattered archway. Fear had painted their faces with pale streaks, but she recognized the faint glimmer of hope sparked by the imperceptible intervention. She allowed herself a brief satisfaction, knowing the Sisterhood had again nudged fate in favor of survival. Then, without hesitation, she slipped deeper into the ruins, moving toward the heart of the city where more precarious balances awaited. The night air carried the faint resonance of liturgy from distant cathedrals, the chants mingling with the stench of smoke and the sharp tang of ozone from stray energy discharges. Somewhere, a servitor clattered, its half-dead circuits sparking dangerously, yet functioning sufficiently to continue its task. Valeria paused to consider the enormity of her role. Every survival, every shifted outcome, every whisper of guidance created ripples she would never witness, yet she acted without pause. The sisterhood was not for accolades. Its mission was faith, discipline, and unseen influence. She wondered if, centuries from now, anyone would even know these acts had occurred. Perhaps, she mused, that was the point. As the first hints of dawn painted the high spires in muted gold, Valeria reached the upper levels of the ruined manufactorum, overlooking the chaos she had traversed. Fires still burned, smoke still rose, and the hum of distant combat drones buzzed faintly. But the supply cache remained intact, the conscripts alive, and the orc raiders had moved on. It was a minor victory, almost invisible to those who would record history, yet vital in the broader scheme of survival. She allowed herself a moment of stillness, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, the whisper of sisters who had guided her path, and the faint presence of the Emperor's light reflecting off distant spires. And then, as if on cue, a subtle shift occurred, a minor tremor in the structure beneath her boots, a tremor only she noticed, and perhaps only she could interpret. It was a reminder that the work was endless, that survival was a fragile illusion, and that the sisterhood's vigilance must never falter. Somewhere, hidden in the smoke and shadow, the true stakes were already moving beyond her perception, yet she knew instinctively that the threads she had touched tonight would extend into events far larger than this ruined city. Valeria's gaze lifted to the distant horizon, where the first rays of light barely touched the upper spires of the hive. Somewhere beyond the haze, battles raged that she could not influence directly. Yet in the silent streets below, the choices made in obscurity, small, precise, deliberate, would endure, shaping survival and fate in ways the galaxy would never acknowledge. The veil of night was lifting, but the work of the Silent Sisterhood was eternal, invisible, and absolute. The faint sound of distant vox calls and the creak of steel in the waking city reminded her that tomorrow would demand the same vigilance, the same invisible mastery over chaos. Tonight had been but the first ripple in a current that stretched far beyond the eye, and Valeria, as ever, would remain the unseen guide. The convent rose like a fortress of bone and stone atop the jagged cliffs of the hive world's uppermost tier, its spires clawing at the heavens as if to claim a fragment of the void itself. Its outer walls bore the scars of centuries, blast craters from orc bombardments, scorch marks from failing Prometheum conduits, and the etched prayers of generations of sisters, worn smooth by devotion and weather alike. Inside, the corridors twisted and turned like the veins of some immense, slumbering creature, each passage a conduit for whispered ritual, hidden vigilance, and the subtle, unseen guidance of the Silent Sisterhood. Few entered uninvited, fewer still emerged unobserved. Sister Superior Althea moved among the halls with a serenity that masked the tension vibrating through the convent. Her robes, black as the void beyond the hive, were trimmed with faint metallic filigree that glimmered when touched by the flickering light of wall-mounted ceramite lamps. Each movement was precise, deliberate, an outward reflection of decades spent navigating the web of duty, secrecy, and divine service. She had received fragmented reports from her scouts. The acolyte Valeria had survived the night's bombardment in the lower spires, a singular instance of success among the chaos. Althea's mind traced the ripple effect of this event, the imperceptible yet undeniable influence the sisterhood wielded, shaping the tides of war without recognition, without reward. Within the convent's sanctum, rows of sisters moved in silent choreographies, their lips forming prayers as their fingers traced sacred glyphs over data slates, reliquaries, and servitor interfaces. The air smelled of incense, scorched metal, and a faint tang of ozone from hidden power conduits, a sensory mixture that had become the essence of the sisterhood's presence. It was here, amid the careful ritual and mechanical hum, that the sisters' true influence manifested. Not in acts of overt violence or open command, but in the meticulous orchestration of circumstance, in the subtle manipulation of probability, and in the quiet, patient shaping of fate. Althea paused before a bronze reliquary etched with the emblem of the Emperor's Aquila, her fingertips brushing the worn surface as she considered the challenges ahead. Orc incursions were escalating across the region. The planetary defense forces were stretched thin, their discipline fraying under pressure from within and without. Yet the Sisterhood's interventions were already in motion, small, invisible nudges that would ripple outward, guiding the actions of soldiers, conscripts, and officials alike. Every decision carried weight, and the convent itself was a nerve center for calculations unseen, strategies unspoken, and loyalties tested in silence. Down a shadowed corridor, a novice named Sister Seraphine hurried, her heart hammering as she delivered urgent messages between chambers. She had not yet fully mastered the art of invisibility, the subtle manipulation of presence and attention that defined the Sisterhood's work. Yet even her small actions carried significance. A misplaced word could redirect suspicion, a delayed step could allow survival, and the slightest hesitation might tip the balance of life and death. The sisters observed and corrected, guiding without revealing, influencing without acknowledgement. In Seraphine's faltering steps, Althea recognized both the vulnerability and potential of their order, a duality that required vigilance, wisdom, and an almost cruel patience. At the heart of the convent, the great hall of silent prayer stretched upward, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the faintest murmurs of devotion. Here, the Sisterhood convened to discuss strategy in coded prayer, subtle gesture, and the shared understanding that the universe observed them in part and ignored them in part. Every action, every silent choice, was accounted for and projected across the hive, influencing events in ways visible only to those who understood the hidden currents of power. It was a discipline that required faith in the unseen, trust in one another, and an intimate knowledge of how chaos could be harnessed without ever appearing to interfere. And yet, even in the sanctity of ritual, danger was present. Rumors of orc saboteurs, of rogue adeptus administratum officials, and of heretical elements moving in shadow had reached the convent. Althea felt the weight of responsibility keenly. Every life preserved was a potential seed of salvation or corruption. Every decision, however subtle, could change the fates of thousands. She allowed herself a brief reflection on the paradox of the Sisterhood, the power to influence, the responsibility to remain unseen, and the constant tension between action and faith. In these halls, nothing was ever truly accidental. Everything was deliberate, calibrated, and cloaked in silence. A distant clang echoed through the convent's outer walls, the sound of heavy machinery jarred by tremors that shook loose centuries of accumulated dust and incense. Sister Althea moved toward the disturbance with measured grace, aware that every echo in these corridors could signify an ally, a threat, or merely the shifting weight of the building itself. The convent was alive, in a way the Imperium rarely recognized, a living nexus of devotion, discipline, and clandestine power. Each corridor served as a conduit for information, and every shadow was a potential sentinel. Even now, unseen sisters observed the movement of visitors, novices, and distant enemies, their eyes both literal and figurative, threading connections invisible to all but themselves. In a hidden chamber, Sister Seraphine knelt beside a dormant servitor, her fingers tracing the delicate circuitry that allowed it to act as a messenger, scout, and subtle manipulator of physical events. The servitor had been damaged during the previous night's bombardments, yet with careful adjustment and whispered prayers, Seraphine coaxed it back into operational status. Its mechanical limbs twitched uncertainly, and a faint hum resonated through the chamber, a testament to the bond between sister and machine. The act was minor, almost imperceptible, yet in the broader scope of the war-torn hive, it was vital. This servitor would deliver messages, trigger small diversions, and subtly influence outcomes far beyond the convent's walls. The sisters understood the calculus. Invisibility was a tool as powerful as any bolter, and patience was the weapon of the faithful. Althea's thoughts drifted to Valeria, still navigating the ruins of the lower spires, guided by instincts nurtured within the order. The acolyte's survival was no accident. It was the product of centuries of discipline, layered guidance, and unseen coordination. The sisters' influence was subtle yet omnipresent, a tapestry woven across the battlefield of life and death, known only to themselves and whispered about in the rumors of the devout. It was a power that demanded restraint, humility, and unwavering focus, for the smallest misstep could unravel a delicate pattern, allowing chaos to consume even the most carefully calculated efforts. The convent's inner sanctum held a map of the local sector, encoded not in plain language but through glyphs and markings understood only by those trained in the sisterhood's methods. Althea traced her fingers across the etched diagram, noting areas of unrest, points of danger, and paths where intervention could prevent disaster. The orc incursions had intensified, yet the sisterhood's reach extended far beyond immediate combat. By altering the perceptions and actions of key individuals, soldiers, scribes, officials, they created a network of subtle influence that could shape battles, preserve lives, and guide the Imperium's outcomes without leaving evidence. Every act was invisible, every intervention silent, yet each was deliberate and precise, a manifestation of devotion that existed outside recognition. A sudden shift in the corridors signaled the arrival of an unexpected visitor. A lone Arbeitsofficer, weary and unsure, sought an audience with Althea. His presence was an anomaly, a disruption of the carefully maintained rhythm of the convent, yet it was also an opportunity. She met him with calm authority, her gaze steady and unyielding. Words were few. Her presence conveyed both dominance and discretion. Through subtle inference, suggestion, and the careful manipulation of perception, she guided his decisions, steering him away from sensitive areas and toward actions that would serve the sisterhood's purposes without ever revealing their existence. To an outsider, it would seem a fortuitous choice. To those within the convent, it was deliberate, precise, and orchestrated. By the time night fell again, the convent had resumed its quiet vigilance. Candles flickered in shadowed alcoves, the mechanical hum of dormant servitors mingled with whispered prayers, and every sister resumed her silent watch. The echoes of distant artillery and the murmur of the hive beyond were reminders that the world remained chaotic, dangerous, and unpredictable. Yet within these walls, the sisterhood held a fragile dominion, a mastery of circumstance and consequence that few could comprehend. Their work was endless, invisible, and unacknowledged, yet it shaped survival, preserved lives, and ensured that hope, however tenuous, remained. Althea paused before a stained glass window depicting the Emperor, his visage serene amidst the chaos. Light filtered through, painting the stone floor with muted gold and crimson. She allowed herself a brief reflection on the paradox that defined their order: the power to shape events, the necessity of remaining unseen, and the burden of responsibility for actions that could alter fate itself. In silence, in shadow, and through devotion, the sisters ensured that even in the darkest nights, the glimmer of survival persisted. The hidden influence of the Silent Sisterhood extended outward, threading through chaos like an invisible current, preparing the stage for consequences that would ripple across worlds, unobserved yet undeniable. The corridors of the convent stretched on, labyrinthine and alive, as the sisters moved through them with quiet purpose. Each step, each gesture, each whispered prayer was a part of the larger design, a subtle orchestration that would shape events far beyond the walls of the sanctuary. Somewhere in the hive below, Valeria's actions continued to unfold, guided by the unseen hand of her order, a single thread in the vast, hidden tapestry of influence. And as the first hints of dawn approached once more, the convent held its breath, aware that the balance between intervention and observation was fragile, that every choice carried consequences unseen, and that the Silent Sisterhood's work, unacknowledged, eternal, and absolute, was far from complete. The morning light fell unevenly across the jagged spires of the hive city, cutting through the lingering smoke in streaks that painted the streets in muted amber and gray. Sister Valeria had returned from her night among the ruins, yet her rest was brief and shallow. The city's wounds had not healed, and the rhythm of survival demanded her constant vigilance. Each breath carried the smell of scorched metal, ash, and the faint tang of blood from distant skirmishes. Every corner might conceal a threat, every shadow could conceal opportunity. Her mind, honed by training and tempered by faith, sifted constantly through the layers of perception, weighing action against consequence, observation against interference. The Sisterhood's doctrine was clear: intervention must be precise, invisible, and deliberate. Yet precision carried weight, and the act of choosing, of determining whose survival mattered, whose death was acceptable, pressured the conscience like a vice. Valeria moved through the lower sectors, encountering civilians whose lives teetered on the edge, soldiers unprepared for the realities of war, and mechanized servants barely functional under the strain of ceaseless combat. Every choice she made rippled outward, influencing outcomes she could not fully witness, and yet she bore the responsibility alone. The weight was not merely strategic, it was moral, spiritual, and profoundly human. As she navigated the maze of collapsed streets, she came across a wounded guardsman, his armor scorched and dented, vox grills shattered. He lay beside a fractured transport, murmuring prayers to saints long forgotten. To aid him would draw her into visibility, risk exposure, and potentially compromise larger interventions already set in motion. To leave him would violate the sacred trust the sisterhood had instilled, to preserve life when possible, even in silence. Valeria hesitated, feeling the strain of her training against the pull of conscience. The choice was immediate, and yet it carried consequences that might unfold across days, weeks, or even months. Her hands moved almost without thought, adjusting a hidden beam above the guardsman's position, redirecting the shifting rubble just enough to shield him from a falling segment of masonry. The act was silent, unseen by all but herself, yet profound in its impact. The guardsman would survive, continue fighting, and unknowingly participate in the broader orchestration of the sisterhood's will. Valeria's chest tightened with the realization that her life was defined not by open heroism but by these quiet, morally complex decisions, each with stakes as high as any battlefield confrontation. The streets seemed to pulse with the consequences of choices made elsewhere. A supply cache partially collapsed, a hidden orc patrol bypassed due to a subtle misalignment of sentry lights, a civilian child rescued from the edge of chaos by an invisible hand. Each moment tested her patience, her resolve, and her understanding of morality in a universe where visibility and acknowledgement were luxuries the sisterhood could not afford. Every life she touched carried weight, every action left an imprint, yet the order itself demanded silence, discretion, and absolute faith in the unseen currents of influence. Her path eventually led her to the remnants of a small manufactorum, where a group of technicians and scribes had been trapped under collapsed girders. Their fear was palpable, their confusion raw, and yet they were moments away from disaster that would have been permanent without intervention. Valeria adjusted the hydraulic pressure of a damaged crane, redirected the flow of promethium fumes, and guided the trapped workers toward an escape route only she could discern. Every movement was calculated, deliberate, yet rendered invisible by the chaos around her. To any observer, it was chance, survival, or fortune. To Valeria, it was faith enacted through discipline, morality executed through silence. She paused briefly to catch her breath, the weight of her choices pressing against her chest like an invisible chain. Her training allowed her to act efficiently, but it could not shield her from the emotional toll of these decisions. In the quiet moments between action, she felt the full scope of her responsibility. Every life saved, every death averted, carried moral weight she alone would bear. The sisterhood's code demanded obedience, yet the conscience demanded reflection, and these two forces were rarely in perfect alignment. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the fractured streets and illuminating the scars left by both orc raids and human neglect. Valeria's path carried her further into the heart of the city, where the consequences of hidden choices would intersect with the larger currents of war. Somewhere beyond the rubble, others were making decisions with similar stakes, unaware of how their actions would be influenced, preserved, or redirected by the Silent Sisterhood. The moral burden of invisible influence pressed upon her, yet she continued, moving like a shadow among shadows, guided by faith, discipline, and the relentless need to act where others could not see. By midday, the city had taken on a grim rhythm, its survivors moving between pockets of destruction as though navigating a fractured lattice of destiny. Valeria continued her silent path through the ruins, aware that every step, every intervention, carried consequences that would unfold far beyond her sight. A patrol of Skitarii moved through the streets, their cold red optics scanning for threats, oblivious to the subtle guidance of the sisters that ensured both enemy and civilian were misdirected at the right moment. The Sisterhood's influence was not brute force. It was careful orchestration, a precise manipulation of probability and circumstance. Every heartbeat, every breath, every chance survival was a thread in an invisible tapestry she alone partially understood. Her thoughts returned to the wounded guardsman she had saved earlier. He now staggered along the debris-strewn streets, unaware of how narrowly he had escaped death. To the rest of the Imperium, such survival was mundane, accidental even. But Valeria knew better. Every act of the Sisterhood carried weight, every choice a moral calculus that demanded accountability. Her heart ached with the recognition that for all their power, they remained unseen, unpraised, and unacknowledged, forced to bear responsibility in silence. The burden was not merely physical or tactical, it was spiritual, a constant reminder of the paradox at the center of their order. In a narrow alleyway, she encountered a group of civilians trapped behind a fallen wall, the heat of a leaking promethium line threatening to ignite a conflagration. There was no time to hesitate. She signaled to a nearby servitor with a barely perceptible gesture, guiding its mechanical limbs to lift debris just enough to create a path. The civilians moved cautiously, their faces etched with terror and awe, entirely unaware of the Sisterhood's invisible hand that had preserved them. Valeria observed silently, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a life saved, yet immediately noting the ripple effects. Survival would bring new responsibilities, new dangers, and perhaps unintended consequences, all of which she could not control. This was the eternal tension of the Sisterhood, to act with precision, yet to accept that even perfect action could not guarantee the outcome of the universe. As the day wore on, Valeria's path led her to the remnants of a small administrative outpost, its scribes and clerks frozen in confusion after an orc bombardment had shattered both structure and order. Among them, one young data scribe, trembling with fear and indecision, clutched a half-damaged data slate containing critical operational codes. To intervene openly would expose her identity, yet inaction could doom the outpost's ability to coordinate reinforcements. Valeria moved with quiet grace, guiding the scribe through subtle gestures, whispered suggestions, and the almost imperceptible redirection of attention. The codes would reach their destination, the machinery of the Imperium would continue, and yet none would know the Sisterhood had guided the smallest details of survival. Her mind weighed the moral consequences of each act. Every life saved, every disruption prevented, carried ethical weight as profound as any battle engagement. In the Emperor's galaxy, the distinction between duty and morality was rarely simple. The Sisterhood's power was a responsibility, a sacred obligation to act when others could not perceive the stakes. Every decision tested not only skill but conscience. Could one justify the manipulation of events without acknowledgement? Was survival alone enough to sanctify unseen intervention? Valeria did not seek answers. She acted because the work demanded action, not reflection, though reflection inevitably followed. As evening approached, the shadows deepened, and the city exhaled a sigh of temporary reprieve. Fires continued to smolder, servitors clanked weakly as they carried out minimal functions, and the survivors she had touched cautiously began to move with renewed confidence. Valeria paused atop a collapsed archway, looking down at the web of lives subtly influenced by her choices. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of responsibility. In silence, she prayed, not for glory, not for recognition, but for the strength to continue bearing the moral weight of invisible influence. And as night fell once more, the city settled into a tense stillness, the consequences of choices made in silence lingering like ghosts in the streets below. Somewhere, hidden among the ruins, threads of destiny were shifting, and Valeria understood that her interventions, though small and unseen, were shaping the future in ways that no report, no record, and no human eye could ever fully comprehend. The work of the Silent Sisterhood demanded moral clarity, courage, and unwavering faith, yet it offered no solace for conscience or ego. It was a calling, eternal, invisible, and absolute, and Valeria remained its faithful executor, moving like a shadow through a galaxy that would never acknowledge her hand. The segmentum stretched before the fleet like an endless black ocean, dotted with the faint glimmers of distant stars and the occasional spark of void-faring vessels. Across countless worlds, conflict churned endlessly. Orc incursions, traitorous cults, Necron awakenings, and the quiet bureaucracy of the Imperium all colliding in a symphony of violence and indifference. Yet amid the chaos, certain threads of survival and subtle influence moved silently, imperceptibly shaping outcomes that should have been impossible. These were the ripples of the Silent Sisterhood, their reach extending far beyond a single planet or convent, their power invisible yet undeniable to those attuned enough to perceive it. Reports trickled into Sister Superior Althea from distant operatives, scribes, and observant acolytes. Small anomalies, barely recorded, hinted at improbable survival, unaccountable successes, and unexpected shifts in both human and Xenos behavior. Across the segmentum, supply convoys arrived despite being targeted by Orc war bands. Planetary governors survived assassination attempts that should have claimed them. Even local Skitariite patrols operated with uncanny efficiency in areas where data suggested they should falter. To most in the Imperium, these were coincidences, chance, or divine providence. To Althea and the sisters, they were the direct, invisible consequence of disciplined, precise, and morally weighty interventions. Valeria, now serving as a mentor for a small group of acolytes newly initiated into the Order, moved with a growing understanding of the scale of their influence. Her lessons were subtle: how to observe patterns without disrupting them, how to weigh moral imperatives against tactical necessity, and how to manipulate perception without leaving evidence. She spoke rarely, allowing observation to teach the novices, guiding them through example rather than instruction. A misplaced word could betray secrecy. A small hesitation could allow disaster. Every action was deliberate, calibrated, and folded into a larger design that none outside the Sisterhood could fully comprehend. The consequences of these invisible interventions were not always apparent immediately. On one mining world, a shipment of promethium had arrived intact despite an Orc ambush, later attributed to the conscientious actions of a low-ranking acolyte manipulating servitors and environmental systems. On another, a planetary governor survived a sabotage attempt, the weapon malfunctioning due to subtle redirection of mechanical failure orchestrated by unseen hands. Across the segmentum, whispers began to circulate, rumors of impossible interventions, miracles that were neither psycho-driven nor publicly recognized, hints of a network that shaped survival with uncanny precision. To those sensitive enough to perceive them, these events suggested something greater, something orchestrated, yet always untraceable. Althea observed these developments from the convent's upper chambers, her mind mapping probabilities and outcomes across the wider theater of war. The Sisterhood's work was no longer confined to the city or planet. It was becoming a lattice of influence, touching worlds far beyond their immediate awareness. Every acolyte, every servitor, every coded glyph of guidance contributed to a network that spanned thousands of kilometers, threading through the machinery of the Imperium in ways few could detect. The moral and spiritual weight of this reach was immense. Every choice had consequences, and even the most careful interventions could ripple outward unpredictably. Yet restraint, discipline, and faith remained the Order's guiding principles. Some rumors reached the ears of the Adeptus Administratum, whispered among scribes, debated in hushed council chambers. How could supply lines remain intact in areas of constant Orc activity? How could certain planetary governors survive repeated attempts on their lives? Was there a hand guiding events unseen? Most dismissed these whispers, attributing them to divine intervention or statistical anomaly. Few considered the alternative, that a hidden order of devoted sisters operated with skill, precision, and moral clarity, moving through the galaxy unseen and unrecorded. The stories began to take on a life of their own, threads of legend intertwining with fact, laying the groundwork for myth that would extend beyond individual lifetimes. And yet, even at this scale, the work remained intensely personal. Each acolyte was confronted daily with the consequences of choices made in silence. Survival, though a measure of success, was also a burden. Each life preserved by subtle intervention carried the weight of responsibility, and each decision left unacknowledged yet morally charged. Across the segmentum, the sisters moved like shadows, threading influence through battles, bureaucracies, and urban landscapes, their work unseen but profoundly felt. Althea looked out at the stars from the convent's highest observation chamber, feeling the vastness of the galaxy press against the fragile order they maintained. Somewhere, distant worlds waited, their fates touched by hands the universe would never recognize. Somewhere, the rumor of unseen intervention was growing, the first seeds of legend taking root. The Silent Sisterhood existed in paradox, invisible yet essential, unacknowledged yet decisive, a force that moved the Imperium's machinery without ever leaving its mark on official record. Night fell across the segmentum, the void beyond dotted with distant stars and drifting wreckage from battles that had long since ended. Sister Valeria stood atop the observation deck of a hab-block converted into a covert sisterhood outpost, her gaze sweeping over the distant horizon. Every blinking light, every flicker of movement in the underhives and manufactorums, represented a nexus of life and death she could influence. The scale of their work had expanded far beyond a single planet, yet the principles remained unchanged. Precision, discretion, and moral responsibility guided every decision. Reports from acolytes reached her via secure channels, encoded glyphs, barely perceptible shifts in data flow, subtle signals embedded in mundane communication networks. Across the segmentum, convoys were rerouted to avoid ambushes, engineers salvaged critical components from collapsing manufactorums, and Skitarii patrols avoided catastrophic missteps, all without leaving evidence of interference. To the untrained observer, these events were chance. To Valeria, they were proof of the Sisters' invisible web, stretching across systems, binding outcomes, and preserving life in ways no one would ever recognize. The moral weight of such power pressed upon her. Every choice, every small nudge, carried consequences both immediate and far-reaching. Some decisions were easy, the redirection of a misaligned hydraulic line, the subtle guidance of a lost convoy. Others were agonizing, choosing which lives to prioritize when a sudden orc strike left hundreds exposed, weighing the survival of a squad against the potential collapse of an entire sector. The Sisterhood's doctrine demanded that no action be taken for glory, yet the conscience could not be silenced entirely. Valeria felt the tension acutely, a constant reminder that morality and obedience often diverged in the shadows of invisible influence. A distant Vox message reached her, a report of a planetary governor's survival after an assassination attempt in an outer system. The weapon had misfired, a minor mechanical failure that had spared the target. Valeria knew it was not chance. An acolyte, guided by her hand and the Sisterhood's teachings, had orchestrated the subtle redirection that saved a life pivotal to the Imperium's stability. The ripple of this intervention would extend far, though it would never appear in official records. Such victories were silent, and their significance invisible to all but those trained to recognize them. Even as the Sisters expanded their reach, they faced the challenge of perception. Across the segmentum, rumors began to circulate, stories of impossible survival, whispered miracles, and untraceable interventions. Some were exaggerated, some distorted by fear or faith, yet all contained a kernel of truth. Valeria understood the power of these rumors. They served both as warnings and as inspiration, shaping the beliefs and decisions of those who would never know the Sisterhood existed. The myth and the reality intertwined, creating a lattice of influence that extended even beyond their immediate control. From her vantage point, Valeria considered the vast scope of the segmentum, the countless systems and worlds teetering between survival and annihilation. The Sisterhood's influence, though subtle, was real. Their discipline, their faith, and their willingness to bear responsibility for outcomes unseen allowed them to thread survival across impossible odds. Each acolyte, each servitor, each hidden intervention was a single stroke in a vast, invisible canvas, a canvas whose patterns would only be understood by those capable of perceiving the imperceptible. And yet, the Sisters were not infallible. Even the most carefully orchestrated interventions could produce unexpected consequences. A slight miscalculation, a delayed action, or a misread signal could cascade into disaster. Valeria felt the constant tension of this reality, the weight of possibility pressing against every decision. It was a burden she bore willingly, guided by faith, training, and the knowledge that the work of the Sisterhood, though invisible, preserved life and shaped outcomes across worlds. As the night deepened, Valeria's thoughts returned to her acolytes, the novices whose training she nurtured. They were the future of this silent network, the next generation of unseen guides and moral arbiters. Each lesson imparted, each subtle instruction given, was part of a larger, unbroken chain stretching across the segmentum. In time, their influence would echo farther than even she could imagine, touching worlds, lives, and destinies without acknowledgement or record. The galaxy would move, as it always did, unaware of the subtle hands shaping its course. The stars beyond the Hablock reflected faintly in her eyes, distant and indifferent, yet threaded with possibility. Somewhere in the segmentum, battles raged, lives were lost, and chaos threatened to overwhelm order. Yet through the unseen influence of the Silent Sisterhood, survival persisted. Intervention, invisible and precise, rippled outward, threading hope through despair and order through chaos. Valeria felt the quiet satisfaction of unseen mastery, tempered by the weight of moral responsibility that would never be recognized, never celebrated, yet was no less real for being hidden. As dawn approached, the galaxy beyond continued to turn, oblivious to the web of influence that shaped it. The Silent Sisterhood remained unseen, their work eternal and absolute, stretching across the segmentum like a shadow that preserved life, guided fate, and left the Imperium none the wiser. And in the quiet of the convent, as the first light touched the spires, Valeria prepared for the next day, knowing that each decision, each intervention, and each act of moral courage would continue to ripple across the stars, unobserved yet indelibly etched into the course of survival. The spires of Terra shimmered faintly in the eternal light of the Emperor, a city of immeasurable weight and silent judgment. Across the planet, the pulse of the Imperium thrummed through manufactorums, cathedrals, and data vaults, each vessel of human endeavor quietly tethered to the Golden Throne. To the faithful, the Astronomicon shone as a beacon, a guiding light for starships traversing the void. To the Silent Sisterhood, it was also a mirror, a reflection of the imperceptible work they carried out across countless worlds. Every intervention, every life preserved, every ripple of fate manipulated in secrecy was part of the greater lattice that kept humanity from unraveling in the face of endless war and unrelenting Xeno's threat. Sister Superior Althea walked the high corridors of the convent, her robes whispering across the cold stone floor, and considered the threads of rumor that had begun to weave themselves around the Sisterhood's deeds. Across the segmentum, tales spoke of impossible survival, uncanny guidance, and acts of providence without origin. Some whispered that the sisters' influence extended even to the Golden Throne itself, that their subtle manipulations reached the inner sanctums of Terra in ways mortals could neither perceive nor comprehend. These were rumors, prayers, conjectures whispered in fear and awe, yet they carried weight in the minds of the devout. Faith and speculation intertwined, creating a tension between what could be seen, what could be known, and what could only be inferred. Valeria moved through the silent halls, her footsteps echoing faintly against the carved stone. She carried no weapons beyond her faith, no recognition beyond the silent gratitude of those whose lives she preserved. And yet in her mind the scale of her responsibility stretched across thousands of kilometers, encompassing lives, machinery, and destinies alike. Every decision was informed by both strategy and morality, every act a negotiation with invisible forces. The work of the Sisterhood was at once local and cosmic, influencing immediate survival while threading the currents of fate across the galaxy, shaping outcomes that would ripple to Terra, and possibly beyond, in ways no human record could ever trace. In a small, hidden chapel, she knelt before an icon of the Emperor, light from a distant stained glass window painting the floor in muted gold and crimson. Her prayers were quiet, not for her own protection or recognition, but for guidance, wisdom, and the discipline to carry the weight of unseen consequence. Somewhere within the sprawling halls of the Imperial Palace, rituals occurred that no sister could witness, yet the echoes of those rituals reached into her world as faint currents, guiding subtle choices and revealing threads of influence she might otherwise overlook. Faith, discipline, and observation converged, forming a lattice of decision and action whose complexity rivaled the very machinery of the Imperium. The convent's observatories revealed distant constellations of light, signals from acolytes and hidden agents, the faint hum of servitors working in coordination across vast distances, and anomalies in supply lines or Skitarii patrols that hinted at successful interventions. To the untrained observer, these were random events, statistical quirks, or miracles. To Valeria, they were signs that the lattice of the Sisterhood's influence was extending, touching lives, guiding outcomes, and preserving order where chaos threatened to consume all. Each ripple carried both strategic and moral weight, a reminder that the unseen could bear the heaviest burdens. Yet the specter of consequence was never distant. Every life preserved through intervention brought with it unseen moral debts, questions that could not be answered openly, and the constant tension between action and restraint. The Sisterhood's work was effective because it was invisible, precise, and morally complex. Each choice demanded judgment and clarity, for a single misstep could cascade across systems, undoing the careful balance that preserved lives and maintained order. Valeria knew this well. The weight of every unseen hand she guided, every act she initiated, and every ripple she set in motion pressed on her conscience like an invisible throne, a reminder that power and responsibility were inseparable. As the day approached in the sectors below, whispers of impossible survival began to coalesce into legend. Across worlds, individuals noted with unease or awe the uncanny success of otherwise fragile missions. Rumors spoke of guiding hands, protective shadows, and unseen interventions that shaped survival with eerie precision. Faith and speculation intertwined with fact, creating a web of perception that neither fully confirmed nor denied the Sisterhood's influence. The Silent Sisters existed between worlds, between events, and between perception and reality, a paradox of action without recognition, guidance without acknowledgement, and influence without visibility. From the convent's highest tower, Valeria looked out across the horizon of a war-torn planet, sensing the delicate currents of life and death that flowed beneath her feet. Somewhere, beyond the reach of even the most vigilant acolyte, threads converged, battles yet to be fought, lives yet to be preserved, destinies yet to be shaped. The Golden Throne remained distant, a symbol of ultimate authority and impossible divinity, yet the Sisterhood's lattice of influence threaded through its domain, affecting the practical reality of survival and faith alike. She understood that their work was eternal, unseen, and absolute, an invisible force anchoring life and order in a galaxy consumed by unending conflict. The sun dipped beneath distant spires, casting shadows that seemed to stretch across space and time itself. The Silent Sisterhood remained vigilant, each intervention, each moral choice, and each ripple across the segmentum a testament to unseen faith. In the quiet of the convent, as the galaxy moved unknowing around them, Valeria felt the weight of the unseen throne press gently yet insistently upon her soul, a reminder that the work of the faithful, invisible and absolute, would endure far longer than recognition, far longer than memory, and far longer than the fleeting chaos of battle.